The door closed behind me with a loud bang. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't an accident. It was my own brother who closed it, firmly, angrily, as if by doing so he could erase every night I spent watching over our father's life. As if in that moment, everything I represented became a burden he was finally free of. There had been weeks of sleeplessness, entire nights in the hard hospital chair, his legs numb and his back screaming for rest. I held Dad's hand while he was delirious, while he writhed with fever or complained about bed sores that no one else dared touch. I learned to understand his gestures, his sighs, his fears. I fed him with a spoon. I changed his soaked diapers. I whispered in his ear when the pain was so intense he couldn't even scream. And yet, when I returned home, after all that sacrifice, the only welcome I received was his harsh, dry voice. "Now at it. We don't want to see you here." At first, I thought I'd heard wrong. I stood in the doorway, my small suitcase at my feet, still wearing my hospital visitor's bracelet. My brother, Daniel, wouldn't look me in the eye. He just pointed toward the street, like someone pointing at a trash can. "You did what you had to do, but this isn't your home anymore." My heart was pounding, but my legs weren't moving. I felt like my whole body had frozen, as if something inside me had suddenly shut down. I looked around. The dining room was the same. The family photos were still on the wall. The chair where I used to sit to feed Dad soup was still in the same corner. But everything felt different, hostile, cold, as if I'd never belonged there. I tried to speak. "Daniel, Dad needs me. He's not well yet." But he didn't let me finish. He raised his voice. "Dad is in my care now. You've done your duty. We're not going to burden you anymore." Carrying. That word hit me harder than a punch. I was speechless. Because what I had done wasn't a burden. It was love. It was devotion. It was everything a daughter could give when her father was slowly dying before her eyes. But for Daniel, all of that was irrelevant. He was the successful son, the one who lived in Dallas and came only to sign papers, the one who took selfies next to his father's bed to upload to social media with phrases like, "Take care of them today, because tomorrow they may not be here." Hypocrite. Fake, but with a white smile and an iron shirt. I, on the other hand, arrived every day with shoes dirty from walking so much, with dark circles under my eyes from working double shifts at the laundry, with my back bent from changing sheets and carrying IV bags. But no one saw that. No one celebrated it. And now, they didn't even appreciate it. I took a step inside, as if asking permission with my eyes. Daniel stepped back. "Don't even try it. If you don't leave now, I'll call the police." And he said it seriously, without hesitation, as if he were a stranger talking to an intruder. My throat closed. Something inside me wanted to scream, to break everything, to slam doors. But I didn't, because I knew screaming wouldn't change anything, because I understood in that instant that there was no going back. That wasn't my home. That was never my home. It was just a place where I served, as a servant, as a nurse, as a shadow. I grabbed my suitcase. It was small. It held everything I owned, my clothes, my worn-out sneakers, a notebook with notes on Dad's medications, and an old photo from when we were still all smiling at the table, before life separated us, before ambition and selfishness turned my brother into someone I no longer recognized. I crossed the street without looking back. The wind was blowing hard. The streetlight was flickering, and in my ears, I could still hear her voice telling me to leave, that they didn't want me there. I didn't know where to go. I had no one to call. My few friends were co-workers who had their own problems, their own children, their own parents. I couldn't force myself, not after what had just happened. I sat on a bench at the bus station. Cars, people, noise passed by, but I didn't hear anything. Only that dense silence that settles in your chest when you realize that everything you lived for no longer exists. My hands were shaking. I didn't know if it was from the cold, from fear, or from abandonment. A little boy ran by, holding a lollipop. He tripped and fell. His mother rushed to pick him up, to clean his knees, to hold him tight. And that's when the tears started to fall. Because I realized I no longer had anyone running to me. No one to pick me up. No one to hug me and say, "Everything's going to be okay." I took out my phone. I opened the gallery. I started looking at photos of Dad, from when he was still walking, from when he held my hand and said, "You are my strength." I clung to that memory as if it could save me. But memories don't shelter me. They don't feed me. They don't cure loneliness. And yet, something inside me, on that frozen bench in an indifferent city, began to change. Because in the midst of that darkness, a fire was also born. Small, fragile, but real. A fire that told me that if I had been able to care for another with such dedication, maybe it was time to care for myself. I wiped my tears. I took a deep breath. And I promised myself, without knowing how, that this wouldn't be my last night on the streets. That if no one wanted me, I would love myself, even if I was alone, even if it hurt. Because there are expulsions that don't destroy. There are expulsions that awaken you, that tear you away from where you were never wanted, to push you to where you truly belong. And that was the first time I felt that maybe, only maybe, you podia começar de novo. My name is Carla Mendez. I'm 58 years old and I live in San Antonio, Texas. I work as a cleaner in a downtown hospital, one of those that never sleeps. Sometimes people ask me if I like my job, and I always smile. Because people expect a woman like me not to complain. But the truth is, it's not a matter of taste. It's a matter of survival, of having something to keep me going, something that makes me feel like I still have a purpose. Even if it's cleaning the hallways where lives pass through, entering in tears and leaving in silence. My day starts at 5 in the morning. I leave a small room I rent in a house shared with 2 other elderly women, just as tired as I am. I make my coffee with water boiled in an old pot because the microwave has been broken for weeks. I put on my blue uniform with the hand-embroidered initials. I wash it myself in the sink because I don't want to spend money on laundry. And I step out into the morning chill, backpack on, hands inside my coat. The bus stop always smells damp. Sometimes there's a homeless person asleep on a bench, covered with cardboard. Sometimes there's a young mother holding her baby. And almost always there's silence. No one speaks. Everyone stares at the ground, as if in that moment we all share the same thought. We're alive, but barely. When I arrive at the hospital, I greet the guard at the entrance. His name is Raymond. He's a war veteran, and he always offers me a weak coffee in a plastic cup. I accept it with a smile because, even though it's cold and sugarless, it's the closest thing to a humane gesture I receive all day. I swipe my card, change my shoes into well-worn white ones, and start working. I clean waiting rooms, patient bathrooms, empty rooms that still retain the scent of those who have passed away. Sometimes I find torn letters in the trash, tear-stained photos, deflated balloons with encouraging words that no longer have a recipient. I stop to read, not as a gossip, but out of curiosity, because I want to understand, because I wonder if anyone misses that person as much as I miss feeling part of something. Most days they don't speak to me. I'm the cleaning lady, the one who crouches, the one who doesn't have an opinion, the one who appears and disappears without a sound. But I observe, I listen, and I see things that many prefer to ignore. The mother who cries alone in the hallway after receiving bad news. The elderly man who clings to the nurse's hand because he has no one else. The child who wonders why his dad won't open his eyes anymore. I keep all of that here, inside me, as if my bones were an archive of other people's pain. I once saw a young doctor arguing with her father on the phone. She said she couldn't come and care for him because she had too many appointments. She was crying with rage, with guilt. And I, as I scrubbed the floor with a mixture of bleach and tears, thought of my own father, how I dedicated entire years to him, to his ailing body, to his old age, to his silence, and how, in the end, all that love was returned with a door in my face. But I wasn't always invisible. There was a time when I thought that if I did everything right, if I behaved as expected, someone would see me. Someone would value me. I was naive. I believed that sacrifice guaranteed love. That service brought respect. But that's not the case. Not for us. Not for the women who grew up believing that caring was our only destiny. At the hospital, there's a large clock at the entrance. It ticks loudly and echoes into the early morning. Every time I pass by, I look at it and wonder how many more hours I'll be here. How many more early mornings await me, scrubbing floors that will get dirty again. How many more times will I return home with bleeding feet and an empty heart? Once, a new nurse asked me if I had children. I told her no. She said it was a shame, that I seemed to have a mother's soul. I didn't know what to say, because I did. I had a mother's soul, but never a mother's body. Never time to have a life of my own, because I was busy raising a father, healing his wounds, silencing my desires to comply with what was expected of me. I always carry a small bottle of alcohol and a notebook in my bag. The notebook has Dad's medication notes, even though I don't need them anymore. I can't throw it away. It's as if by having it with me, he's still there. Even though he kicked me out, even though I let my brother destroy me. Sometimes I open it and read the medication schedules, the notes he used to write in the wee hours so he wouldn't forget anything. And I realize how much love can be found in small gestures that no one sees. Once, a patient called me. She was alone, very old. She asked me to help her comb her hair. The nurses didn't have time. I walked over, took her brush, and with trembling hands ran my fingers through her thin hair. She closed her eyes and sighed, as if that simple act was the greatest comfort she'd felt in years. Before I left, she said, "Thank you, daughter." And that word disarmed me, because I too needed a mother, because I too needed to be a daughter. Every day I leave the hospital with sore muscles. I struggle to get on the bus. I struggle to keep my eyes open. But the hardest part isn't the physical exhaustion. It's coming home and not having anyone to ask how my day was, no one to listen to my stories, no one to tell me that all this effort is worth it. And yet, every morning I wake up, I shower with cold water, I put on my blue uniform, and I go out again to clean up the footprints of others, because I don't know how to do anything else, because that's how I learned, because caring has become my only way of existing, even if that means never being cared for. Sometimes I wonder what would happen if one day I didn't show up, if I didn't make it to the hospital, if I didn't clean the floors, if I didn't leave the coffee ready for Raymond, if I wasn't there. Would anyone notice? Would anyone call? Or would they just put another woman in my place, as if I'd never been there? But I don't want to think about that, because it hurts, because the idea of being replaceable is too close to reality. Then I breathe. I look up at the sky. I give thanks for another day, and I tell myself there's still time. Time to discover who I am without them. Time to stop being just the woman who cleans, and start being the woman who deserves to be seen. Even if I don't know how to achieve it yet, even if I still find it hard to believe. When I think about my childhood, the first thing that comes to mind isn't an image, but a sound. The sound of the wooden dining room chair scraping against the floor every time my father sat down. It was a dry, repetitive, almost ceremonial creak, and every time I heard it, my body tensed, because I knew the order was coming. The look, the judgment. I was 9 years old when my mother died. I remember her smell of oatmeal soap and freshly ironed clothes. I remember her rough hands, always busy, always moving. She was the only gentle voice in the house, the one who stroked my forehead when I had a fever, the one who told me I could be anything I wanted. The day I lost her, something inside me broke, and it never fully healed. My father didn't cry at her funeral. He stood beside the coffin, arms crossed, jaw clenched. I took her hand, searching for something, some comfort, some sign that I wasn't alone. But her hand was stiff, cold, as if he were deader than she was. From that day on, the house changed. It became a house without laughter, without after-dinner conversation, without songs in the kitchen. Daniel, my brother, was 12 years old. He was always the favorite, the little man of the house, the one who would inherit everything. From a young age, Dad would sit him on his lap to teach him things, how to use tools, how to look firm, how to silence a woman with a single raised eyebrow. On the other hand, he taught me to obey, to be silent, to serve, I remember one afternoon, a few weeks after the funeral, I wanted to keep going to school. I liked reading. I liked writing. I had a teacher who told me I had talent, that my essays made her cry. But Dad looked at me from the head of the table and said, without raising his voice, that it was time I became useful. That school was a luxury for rich girls, that I should stay home and learn to cook. I tried to rebel. I said I wanted to be a nurse, that I wanted to help people like they helped Mom. But Daniel laughed, that mocking laugh he always used when he wanted to make me feel ridiculous. "You're no good at that," he said. "You're too weak." And Dad didn't say anything. He just nodded. And that's how my future was reduced to a list of chores. I got up before dawn to light the firewood. I swept the porch. I washed clothes by hand. I cooked for them. And at the end of the day, when everyone was asleep, I sat in the dark with an old book I'd rescued from Mom's room. It was the only time of day I owned, the only respite. Until one night, my father caught me reading. He took the book from me and threw it into the fire. "I don't want you wasting your time with nonsense," he said. "Women who read fill their heads with ideas that are useless." And he went to sleep as if nothing had happened. I never read in front of him again. By the time I was 13, I was already cooking for 4 people. Dad, Daniel, and 2 uncles, who often came over to drink beer and talk politics as if they were experts. I walked around behind them, serving dishes, and no one even looked me in the eye, as if I were part of the furniture, but they did look at me out of the corner of their eyes, especially one of the uncles. He looked at me differently. He asked me questions I didn't understand. Once, he touched my hand too slowly. I felt dirty, and when I told Dad about it, he just said, "You must have misunderstood," and ordered me not to speak of it again. It was then that I learned to bite my tongue, to pretend I didn't feel, that I didn't see, that it didn't hurt. Sundays were the worst. Everyone would sit around watching TV while I cleaned the kitchen, and if I made a mistake, if I didn't add enough salt, if the rice got burnt, it was always my fault. Daniel would tell me, "That's why you don't have any friends, because you're clumsy." I would hang my head and swallow hard, even though inside I wanted to scream. I never had a birthday. I never had presents, but I did have chores. Every year, more. Every week, more weight on my shoulders. And the older Daniel grew, the more his authority over me grew. At 17, he already spoke to me as if he were my father. He told me how to dress. He checked my cell phone. He told me that if I went out, I had to be back before 6, but he left whenever he wanted. And if I asked anything, he just said, "You're a burden. You have no right to an opinion." In my notebook, I wrote down everything I couldn't say. Today I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize myself. Today I cried silently while washing the dishes. Today I dreamed I was leaving and no one was stopping me. It was my only refuge. That notebook hidden in the false bottom of the closet was my silent cry. I once met a boy at the local grocery store. His name was Miguel. He spoke to me sweetly. He told me my eyes were sad. He invited me for ice cream. I accepted. It was the first time someone treated me like a person, not like a maid, not like a shadow. But when Daniel found out, he yelled at me so hard I thought he was going to hit me. He told me I was staining the family honor. What would Dad think if he saw me holding hands with a nobody? I never saw Miguel again. He left me a letter that I never read, because I hid it before Dad found it. And when I tried to look for it, it was gone. By the time I was 20, I was already Dad's official caregiver. He got sick for the first time that year. High blood pressure, then diabetes, and later, kidney problems. I was the one who learned how to give him his pills, how to keep track of his appointments, how to take him to the hospital on public transportation with him leaning on my arm. Daniel was already living in another city. He only came when he needed money or papers. Dad started depending on me for everything, but he never thanked me. He never said thank you. He never said you did well. He just said, "That's why you're here." And I believed it, because I didn't know how to be anything else anymore, because they never let me be anything else. What hurt the most was that, despite everything, I remained hopeful. I hoped that one day my father would look at me with tenderness, that he would tell me he was proud, that he would recognize my efforts. But that day never came. And the worst part is that, over time, I even stopped hoping for it. Because when hope dies, it leaves a void that doesn't even hurt anymore. It only weighs. It weighs like a stone tied to your chest, that you carry with you everywhere, even when you smile, even when no one notices. That's how I became who I am. Not because I chose it, but because I wasn't allowed to choose. Because I was born into a home where to love was to serve, where silence was the law, where a daughter wasn't a person. She was a tool. And when you're raised like this, it takes a lifetime to understand that you deserve more, that you deserve to speak, that you deserve to live, that you deserve to be, even if you don't know how yet, even if fear still breathes down your neck, even if you still hear deep down that voice telling you you're worthless, even if that voice has the same tone your father had. At 23, I was already my father's official shadow. I knew everything about him, from which leg hurt the most in the winter to how he liked his boiled eggs. I took his blood pressure, organized his pills by color, and accompanied him to the bathroom at night when his body no longer responded. I became his nurse, his cane, his memory, but never his daughter. Because being a daughter means receiving something in return, a gesture, a thank you, a caress, something that confirms that you exist beyond your usefulness. I, on the other hand, became invisible behind my devotion. My day began before sunrise. I lit the stove, made his unsweetened oatmeal, and put on the compression stockings he hated. Then I went to work. Back then, I cleaned houses. I returned just in time to bathe him, feed him dinner, and change his diaper. If he had a fever, I slept on the floor next to his bed, my hand outstretched in case he woke up disoriented. I memorized the sound of his cough, the frequency of his heartbeat, the rhythm of his breathing when he was deep asleep. Daniel didn't come. I called every now and then, asking how he was feeling in a hurried tone, as if I were doing him a favor. When I told him we needed help with the bills, he got angry. He said I should get a better job, that he couldn't carry everything. But I was the one who carried Dad. Literally. I lifted him from the chair to the toilet. I held him under the shower. I picked him up when he fell and cried like a child. He once fell in the hallway at 3 a.m. I got up when I heard the crash. I ran barefoot. I found him shaking, his eyes brimming with tears. I clung to him. I picked him up as best I could, my heart pounding. I scraped my knees in the process. The next day he had a fever and his body ached. But it didn't matter, because he needed me. And I was there. That's how my days were. No rest, no applause, no witnesses. It was the routine of silent sacrifice, a routine that, over time, shaped my body. My hands grew rough. My back began to creak when I stood up. My knees ached when I climbed stairs. But still, I kept going. Because when you're raised to care, you learn to ignore yourself. Sometimes, during the few free hours I had, I would sit by the window, looking out at the street. I would see women walking by with shopping bags, with children, with life, and I would wonder what it would be like to be in their shoes, to have a Sunday to walk leisurely, to have a hug not out of necessity, but out of love. But that wasn't my story. I remember one special date with pain. It was Christmas. I had cooked a turkey. I had decorated the living room. I had put on a dress I'd had in storage for years. I hoped Daniel would come, that he would bring his children, that for once we would feel like family. But he didn't. He called late, saying they were in another state, that things had gotten complicated. Dad didn't say anything. He just continued eating in silence, while I hid my tears with every bite. The years passed. The ailments increased. The panic attacks arrived. The urinary tract infections. The recurring hospitalizations. And I was always the one signing the papers, the one asking for diagnoses, the one learning medical terms no one had taught me. It became my new language. I, who had never been able to study nursing, ended up learning by survival. There were days when I couldn't even remember what day it was. My calendar was filled with medications. Monday, insulin. Tuesday, nephrologist appointment. Wednesday, physical therapy. Thursday, blood sugar check. Friday, deep mattress cleaning. The weekend didn't exist, nor did vacation. A neighbor once asked me if I wasn't bored. I laughed. I didn't understand. Bored? I didn't have time for that. I had to check glucose levels, disinfect utensils, prepare food without salt, but with flavor. Boredom is a luxury, and caregivers aren't entitled to luxuries. Still, there were moments of tenderness, like when Dad would hold my hand without saying anything, or when he looked at me with those eyes that seemed to ask for forgiveness without using words. But he never said it. He never asked for forgiveness. He never acknowledged that he had taken my youth, that he had tied me to a life that wasn't mine. The hardest part was when my body wouldn't respond anymore. Once I had a vertigo attack in the middle of the shower. I fell. I was on the floor for minutes. When I managed to get up, my face wet and my body shaking, I thought about how no one would know if something happened to me. Dad couldn't get up. Daniel didn't call. And I didn't exist for anyone else. I started talking to myself, making up conversations while I cooked, singing children's songs to drown out the silence, because silence can be worse than pain. It's the emptiness that sinks into your bones. It makes you doubt whether you're truly alive or just functioning. My dreams blurred. I no longer remembered what I wanted to be, what I liked, what made me laugh. I had disappeared into the routine, as if each task took a piece of my soul, until I was hollow. But I continued, because duty was stronger than fatigue. Because when your whole life revolves around someone else, you stop knowing how it revolves around you. Sometimes, I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize myself, not because of the passage of time, but because I no longer saw Carla. I only saw the caregiver, the woman in the apron, the shadow, and yet, I kept waiting, hoping that one day Daniel would tell me he appreciated me, that Dad would hug me, that someone would see me. But the days passed, the nights piled up, and the answer never came. Just more silence, more chores, more forgetting. I had learned to exist without witnesses, to hold up another's world with the pieces of my own, to be strong when everything in me wanted to give up. But I no longer knew how much longer I could go on like this, because even shadows sooner or later wear thin, and all that remains is the echo of everything that was never said. Everything changed that early morning when his fever wouldn't go down and his body trembled as if something inside him were silently screaming. That night was different, not because of the temperature on the thermometer or the fragility in his voice, but because of the feeling that settled in the air, like an omen. I watched him from the chair with a blanket over my legs, exhausted but alert, and there was something in his eyes that deeply disturbed me. It wasn't physical pain. It was fear. And that fear pierced me. I tried to calm him, apply cold compresses, check his medications, but nothing worked. His skin was burning. His breathing became more labored, as if each inhalation was a fight against his own body. I called the doctor on call. He told me to take him to the hospital as soon as possible. We left in an ambulance, and during the ride, I held his hand so tightly that my fingers went numb. He didn't speak. He just stared at the ceiling of the unit with moist eyes, as if saying goodbye. When he arrived at the hospital, he was admitted immediately. They gave him oxygen and IV fluids and began the tests. I never left his side. He responded to the doctors as if I were their interpreter. I knew his entire medical history, every medication he was taking, every allergy. I was his living medical history. I stayed there, in the emergency room, waiting. Sometimes standing, sometimes sitting, but always with my heart in my mouth. Hours passed until he was stabilized. The doctor came out and told me about a possible generalized infection, that his body was tired, that it was just a matter of time. I returned to his side. I saw him asleep, his face more aged than ever. He was breathing heavily, but there he was, fighting. And it was at that moment, in that freezing room, with the constant beeping of the monitors, that I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a mix of sadness and relief, because I understood the end was near, and that end brought with it the shadow of my freedom, a freedom I was afraid to desire. The following days were a mix of waiting, fear, and hospital routine. I slept on a metal chair, Sometimes I borrowed pillows from the cleaning staff, who knew me by sight. I ate whatever I could, whatever was left over, whatever someone shared. But I wasn't there for myself. I was there for him. Daniel showed up on the third day. He arrived wearing an expensive shirt and holding a cup of coffee. He looked at me as if he didn't know me. He approached Dad, kissed him on the forehead, and then sat down as if it were a social visit. I asked him if he'd be staying that night. He said he couldn't. He had commitments, that he'd done what he had to do. Come see him. I didn't answer. I just hung my head and went back to wiping Dad's sweat with a damp towel. In the hospital hallways, I learned to read time in the doctor's glances. I knew when there was bad news even before they spoke. I learned to sleep with my shoes on, to live with a change of clothes in a plastic bag. I grew accustomed to the smell of alcohol, the sound of alarms, the invisible ticking of monitors. It was all a familiar choreography, but this time the outcome felt inevitable. One night around 3 a.m, Dad opened his eyes and murmured my name. Not like always. He said it softly, shakily. Carla. Just that. I approached. I took his hand. He squeezed it. And then, for the first time, I knew he was asking me something. Not with words. With his gaze. With his silence. And I understood. He was asking me not to leave him alone. To be with him until the end. To keep doing what I always did. Even when there was nothing left to take care of. And so I did. I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I stayed there until the sun rose again. Pale. Indifferent. At dawn, the doctor told me there was a slight improvement, but it was temporary. That my body was exhausted. I already knew it. I saw it in my skin, in my pulse, in the way I no longer responded to pain. Daniel would come every 2 days, pose for a photo, and leave. I once heard him talking on the phone in the hallway. He said he was tired of the situation and that this has to be resolved soon, as if Dad were a formality, as if his life, his body, his story were an uncomfortable burden he wanted to let go of. I felt rage, a cold rage, the kind you don't shout about, the kind you bottle up and burn inside. When I returned to the room, Dad was asleep. I sat down beside him, held his hand again, and allowed myself to cry. Not for him, for me, for the little girl who wasn't protected, for the young woman who gave up everything, for the woman who was exhausted. I cried in silence. So no one would hear, so as not to be inconvenient. As always, that night, as I left the hospital to get some fresh air, I sat on a bench near the entrance. I saw a couple hugging tightly. An older woman kissed the forehead of her adult son, who was crying like a child. I watched them with a mixture of tenderness and envy, because I never had that, because I gave everything and was never supported. I went back to the room. Dad was still asleep. I sat up. I stroked his face. I told him softly that I was okay, that he could rest, that I was going to be okay. I didn't know if he was lying, but I needed him to believe it. That morning, something changed. Not in him, in me. Because I began to imagine, for the first time in a long time, a life where I didn't have to ask permission to exist. A life of my own, with my name, with my choices, with my peace. And although her breathing remained fragile, every time she exhaled, it seemed to me that she was also exhaling some of the pain that had bound us together for so long. I felt that, perhaps in that ending, there was also a beginning. One I didn't yet understand, but that I was beginning to glimpse, like a small flame in the darkness, like a buried seed that, at last, was beginning to awaken. The morning it all ended was quiet, too quiet. The hospital smelled of fresh disinfectant, as if they were trying to erase the traces of death with bleach. The sun barely filtered through the plastic curtains in the room. Dad was sleeping, or so I thought. I approached, as I did every day, with the soft steps of someone who has learned not to make noise so as not to disturb others. But something was different. He wasn't moving. He didn't have that shallow breathing that had become the soundtrack of our final weeks. I leaned down, took her wrist with the gentleness that only love or habit can provide. I felt no pulse. I waited. I counted to 10. I tried again. Nothing. My chest didn't react with the pain I expected. There were no screams. There were no tears, only silence. A silence that seemed to expand inside me like an empty room that suddenly lights up. I pressed the call button. A nurse arrived, then a doctor. They confirmed what I already knew. They looked at me with that mixture of compassion and routine that those who deal with death every day have. One of them said, "I'm sorry." And I just nodded, because I had no words, because the ones I had become stuck in the years I spent keeping silent. They allowed me a moment alone. I sat next to him. I watched him. He didn't look at peace. He didn't look like he was suffering either. He just seemed absent, as if he'd finally broken free from the body that had held him back. I took his hand for the last time, and in that gesture I didn't feel love. I felt closure, as if a circle had finally closed, one that had trapped me for almost my entire life. I left the room with the bag of his belongings, a couple of shirts, his old Bible, a notebook with numbers I didn't recognize. In the waiting room, Daniel was talking on the phone. He was laughing, as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just lost his father. I approached him and told him simply that Dad had died. He looked at me. He put his phone down. He didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then he sighed and said it was time. That phrase pierced me. It was about time, as if it hadn't been a lifetime, as if years of care, sacrifice, sleepless nights hadn't passed, as if Dad were an old piece of furniture they could finally throw away. We went together to do the paperwork. He hurriedly signed the papers, checked his cell phone, and gave orders as if he knew what he was doing. I watched him, and I understood with painful clarity that for him, all of this was just a burden that had finally been resolved, that he had never stopped to consider what that burden meant to me. At the wake, there were few people, a few neighbors, 2 or 3 childhood friends, a few former colleagues. No one spoke of him as a father. Everyone spoke of his strong character, his seriousness, and how he was a respected man. I listened without intervening, because I didn't know if I wanted to tell the truth or follow the script everyone expected. A woman approached me. She was a distant cousin. She hugged me tightly. She told me I must be devastated. I just closed my eyes, because that wasn't what I felt. What I felt was confusion, an emptiness that didn't hurt, but that wasn't filled either, as if something had been taken away that I no longer wanted, but that had still defined me for so long. After the burial, Daniel asked to talk. We went to the house. I sat in the kitchen, in the same chair as always. He remained standing. He told me that things now had to be organized, that the house had to be sold, that he was in debt, that he couldn't keep up with the place. I asked him what he meant by that. He looked at me fixedly, and with a coldness I still struggle to describe. He said I had to leave, that he had a right to the property, that I didn't own anything, that, if I wanted, I could stay for a few weeks while I found something, but that I shouldn't get used to it. I asked him if he was serious. He repeated everything to me, more slowly, as if I were a silly little girl. Now that Dad's gone, you don't have to stay anymore. That was his exact line. You don't have to stay anymore. I stood up. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just looked at him. And inside, something broke, but not from sadness. It was something else. It was as if, finally, the blindfold had fallen from my eyes, as if I saw my brother without filters. No longer as the boy I cared for, no longer as the man who always made me feel less than. I saw him for what he was, a stranger. I gathered my few things. I packed my clothes in an old suitcase. I grabbed the notebook where I'd written down Dad's recipes, the Bible, the black and white photo of Mom, and I left. I didn't look back. I didn't ask for explanations. I didn't say goodbye. That night, I slept at the bus station. I had nowhere else to go, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like the air was mine, that my steps didn't respond to anyone, that my body wasn't at the service of another. He didn't have a home. He didn't have money, but he had something he hadn't had in decades: choice. At that station, amidst the snores of others and the fluorescent lights, I found myself dreaming, thinking about what I could do, what I'd always wanted. Maybe study, maybe travel, maybe just rest. And as the world continued to turn, I understood that my story didn't end there, that I wasn't the woman who was thrown out. I was the woman who left, by choice, by necessity, by dignity, even though the journey was just beginning, even though it hurt, even though it was scary, because, finally, fear was no longer a chain. It was just a sign that I was alive, truly alive. I woke up on a station bench, my body numb and my soul suspended in a thick fog. Outside, the city was beginning to move, indifferent, as if the world hadn't shuddered inside me the night before. The sound of a broom scraping across cement brought me back to the present. I sat up slowly. My back ached, my eyes swollen, and a knot in my stomach wasn't just hunger. It was fear. It was uncertainty. But it was also a kind of new relief, a void I could begin to fill with my own choices. I spent hours walking aimlessly, my suitcase dragging behind me. I felt like a fallen leaf, without a tree, without roots, but also without chains. With each step, I felt the weight of the years peeling away, layer by layer. I had spent so much time living for others that now, with no one to need me, no one to care for, I struggled to understand what to do with my own existence. And yet, within that confusion, there was a spark that was beginning to burn. I walked to a square. I sat on a bench in the sun, like an old woman seeking only warmth. I closed my eyes. I breathed deeply. For the first time in years, I didn't have a schedule. I didn't have a duty. I didn't have an endless list of things to do for someone else. It was as if the world had opened up before me with a blank page. And that, although it was scary, also filled me with new energy. I went to a community center. I asked if they knew of any temporary shelter. They looked at me warily, the way you look at someone who seems fine on the outside but broken inside. They offered me a bed in a women's shelter. I accepted. That night, I slept in a bunk bed, surrounded by snores, sighs, and bodies as tired as mine. But for the first time in a long time, I slept soundly. I didn't have to wake up to take anyone's fever. I didn't have to get up to heat water. I slept the way you sleep after a storm, with the certainty that even if you're wet, you survived. At the shelter, I met other women with stories as painful as mine. One had escaped a violent partner. Another had been kicked out by her son. Another simply grew old, and no one wanted her home anymore. We talked at night. We shared tea, bread, and words that felt like comfort. I discovered that pain, when shared, becomes lighter. That I wasn't alone. That many carried similar ghosts. One day, a volunteer offered us a therapeutic writing workshop. I hesitated at first, but something in me remembered that old notebook I used to write in as a child. I signed up, and as I picked up the pencil, I felt my hand tremble, as if writing were harder than caring for a dying person. But I did it, and in those first trembling words, a truth emerged that shook me. I wrote, I wasn't kicked out. I left. I repeated it. I underlined it. I cried. And inside, I felt a rift close. Little by little, I began to recover parts of myself I thought were lost. I cut my hair. I bought a colorful blouse at a thrift store. I wore earrings for the first time in years. I walked the streets with a mixture of shyness and pride, like a child learning to ride a bike without training wheels. I joined a public library. I borrowed books on self-care, on boundaries, about women who rebuilt their lives. I fell in love with the story of a woman who, at 60, decided to learn to paint. That night, I dreamed that I was painting too, that my hands, accustomed to scrubbing floors, were now creating beauty. One Sunday, in the plaza where I used to sit, I saw a young woman crying alone. I approached her. I offered her a handkerchief. We didn't speak much. We just looked at each other. In her face, I saw something I recognized, the same emptiness I had felt. I spoke a phrase that came from my soul. No one should feel disposable. She hugged me, and in that hug, I understood that I wasn't just healing. I could also help heal. I started volunteering at the shelter. I washed dishes, swept floors, organized donations, and every action, no matter how small, gave me back a part of my dignity. I was no longer the woman who served out of obligation. Now, I served from the heart, because I wanted to, Because I could. Because choosing to serve is different from being condemned to do so. Eventually, I was offered a small position as a kitchen assistant at a daycare center. I cooked for the elderly. I served them coffee. I listened to them. And each story they told me was like a mirror in which I saw my life reflected, but also my evolution. Because although many of them had losses, pain, and heartbreaks, they also had something else. They had hope. And I was beginning to have it too. One morning, while I was peeling carrots, a woman told me I had a very sweet voice, that I should tell stories. I smiled. I told her I didn't have any. She looked at me tenderly and said, "Of course I did. If your hands have lived so long, imagine what your soul can tell." That phrase stayed with me. That night, in front of a new notebook, I began to write my story from the beginning, not as a victim, but as a witness, as a survivor, as a woman who was made invisible, but who learned to see herself. And as I wrote, I discovered that each word was a healing scar, that I didn't need revenge, that I didn't need recognition, that all I needed was a voice. And for the first time, that voice was mine. Not the one that repeated what others wanted, not the one that swallowed its tears. It was my voice, clear, firm, real. With each page, I reconstructed my story. I restored dignity to that girl who was silenced, to that young woman who was silenced, to that woman who was used. And I understood that I wasn't alone, that every word I wrote could be read by someone who also needed healing. And perhaps, one day, my words would be the handkerchief another woman would find when she cried in a square. Because that's how freedom begins. Not with grand gestures, but with small acts, with the right to say enough, with the strength to walk without permission, with the courage to look in the mirror and say, "I deserve it. I've always deserved it." Even if they've made me believe otherwise, even if they've cast me out as if I were a nuisance. Today, I know I wasn't. I never was. I was just a tired woman. But even tiredness can be transformed into a path, a route, a beginning. And that's what I decided to be, a beginning, for myself, and for all those who come after me. The days began to be tinged with a calm I'd never known, a strange calm, which at first frightened me because it felt too much like abandonment. But little by little, I began to understand that it wasn't abandonment. It was space. Space to breathe. Space to think. Space to ask myself what I wanted, without anyone interrupting with their need, their command, their complaint. For the first time, I had the right to exist without being useful to someone else. And that right didn't come with guilt. It came with a new kind of tenderness toward myself. One Friday, while waiting for the bus after work, I came across a used book stand. I rummaged through it curiously, with no intention of buying anything. But my fingers stopped on a worn copy with a plain cover that read, "Women Who Run with the Wolves." I opened it at random and read a sentence that stopped me in my tracks. It said, "Strong women aren't born that way. They're forged in the fire of what they've survived." I closed the book and bought it without a second thought. That night, I read it all. I underlined paragraphs. I cried. I saw myself reflected in every story. I understood that I wasn't broken. I was being reborn. At my workplace, the older women began to notice the change. One told me she walked with a straighter back now. Another asked if I was in love. I laughed. I told them yes, that I was falling in love with myself. Some didn't understand. But one, the quietest of them all, took my hand and said, "This is how it starts, with self-respect, even if no one else has given it to you." With the first paycheck I saved, I bought a plant, a simple pot with a small purple flower. I put it on the shelf in my room at the shelter. I watered it every day. And in that gesture, in that simple act, I felt like I was watering myself too. Because caring for something that blooms without expecting anything in return is different. It's love, not obligation. Free love, like the love I never had for myself. I began writing every night before bed. Sometimes stories, sometimes memories, sometimes just single words that made me feel. My notebook became my mirror. In it, I didn't lie. I didn't disguise anything. If I was afraid, I wrote it down. If I felt angry, I wrote it down too. If one day I missed the routine with Dad, I accepted it. Because sometimes you miss even what hurt, just because it was the only thing you knew. But writing taught me to separate nostalgia from dependence. I learned that I could remember without wanting to go back. One day, at the community center, they proposed a reading of texts among the women at the shelter. I hesitated to participate. I felt my words were small, intimate, almost sacred. But a friend encouraged me. I read a fragment to her. She looked at me with tears in her eyes. She told me it was as if I had written what she never dared to say. That night, I understood that my story wasn't just mine, that it could also be a mirror for others. That naming the pain made it bearable. Sharing it made it more human. The night of the reading, my voice trembled. My hands were sweaty. My heart was racing. But when I began to read, I felt a peace I'd never felt before. Each word came out like a caress, like an act of justice for that Carla who had remained silent for so long. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then, applause. Small, timid, but honest. A woman came up to me afterward and said thank you, because now I understand it wasn't my fault. That phrase embraced my soul, and I knew that somehow I was beginning to find my purpose. Weeks passed. I managed to rent a small room with an elderly woman who needed company. We cooked together. We washed dishes in silence, listening to the radio. Sometimes she told me stories from her youth. Sometimes she just fell asleep in the rocking chair and I covered her feet with a blanket. It wasn't work. It was companionship. It was humanity. It was peace. I enrolled in an evening storytelling class. There, I met other people who, like me, used words as a lifeline. I learned to speak in public, to use silence, to look people in the eye, to trust my voice. Each class was a victory. Each story told a healing wound. The teacher, a woman with wise wrinkles, told me, "You have a way of telling stories that no one teaches you. That's called truth. And people always listen to the truth." Little by little, I began to show up at literary cafes. I read my texts. Some cried. Others waited at the end to share their own sorrows. I listened. Sometimes I hugged. I felt useful, but not used. Necessary, but not enslaved. Free. As free as I'd never imagined. I was invited to give a talk at a caregiver support center. At first, I thought I had nothing to say. But when I stepped onto the stage and saw the tired faces in front of me, I knew I did. I had everything to say. I spoke to them about boundaries, about guilt, about how misunderstood love can destroy you, about how you can take care of everything and still receive nothing, about how that doesn't diminish your worth. I told them to take care of themselves. Please, don't wait for everything to fall apart to look at each other, because even caregivers need support. When I finished, a woman approached. She hugged me tightly. She told me she'd been caring for her mother for years without help, that no one had ever told her she mattered too, and that listening to me had saved her something she didn't know she was about to lose, her hope. That night, I walked home in the rain. I didn't run. I didn't cover myself. I let the water soak me completely, like a baptism, like a cleansing. I felt alive, whole, mine. And as the drops trickled down my face, I realized it wasn't just a sad story anymore. It was a living story, a story being told, a story still being written, but one that finally had an author. And that author was me, Carla, the daughter, the caregiver, the woman, the survivor, the narrator of her own rebirth. One day, while organizing the books in the community library where I now also worked, I found a yellow folder, forgotten among old volumes. It was marked with faded letters, and when I opened it, I discovered a collection of letters without an addressee. They were texts written by women from different eras, many anonymous, many broken, all survivors. I read each word with a reverence I had never felt for history, because it wasn't history. It was flesh. It was voice. It was a mirror. One of those letters said something that pierced my chest. It said, "No one taught me I could say no." I closed my eyes. I took a deep breath. And I knew there were still dark corners inside me where that no still didn't live. Corners where I still allowed guilt to speak louder than desire. where I still doubted whether I had the right to choose my own battles. And yet, there I was, standing, lucid, transformed, writing my own yes. I began using these letters as part of the workshops I now led for older women. They were small groups. We sat in circles. We shared tea and long silences before we began to talk. Many arrived bent over not only by age, but by the invisible burden of heartbreak, abandonment, and years of invisibility. I asked them to write a letter to themselves, as if they were their best friend. Some didn't know where to begin, but it only took one of them to dare to write that she was tired for the others to begin to open their own wounds. One afternoon, Clara, a 68-year-old woman, read her letter. It said, "I forgive myself for being so silent." And in that moment, the silence became sacred. We all looked at her with a mixture of astonishment and tenderness, because she hadn't screamed, she hadn't cried, she just said it. And that fact alone was revolutionary. Because women of our generation were taught to serve, to yield, to endure, but not to forgive ourselves. That night, I returned home with an emotion that was hard to name. It was pride, yes, but also a sweet sadness, like the kind you feel when you look at a scar that no longer hurts but still reminds you. I sat in front of the mirror. I lit a candle, and I wrote my own letter, "Dear Carla," and I continued with words I'd never said to myself. I thanked myself. I apologized. I hugged myself from the page, and I felt something I'd never felt so clear. Compassion for myself, not pity, not victimhood, true compassion, the kind that says, "I understand why you did what you did, and yet you deserve peace." Days later, a young journalist who had attended one of my readings proposed an interview. At first, I hesitated, not out of fear of speaking, but because of that old reflex of not feeling interesting. What could I possibly say that would be worthwhile? But she insisted. She said my story wasn't just powerful, it was necessary, that many women needed to hear it to understand they weren't alone. I accepted. I sat in front of the camera with my hands clasped in my lap. I talked about my childhood, about my father, about the silences. I talked about my brother, about the night I was kicked out, about the bus station. But I also talked about my hometown, about the workshops, about the letters, about the time a stranger said thank you for speaking what I still can't say. The interview was published on a small channel. I wasn't expecting much, but within days, messages started pouring in. Women of different ages, locations, and accents. They told me their stories. They asked me how to start. They told me my voice had lit a light in them. And although I didn't know how to respond to everything, I felt something profound was happening. That my story was no longer just mine. It was a seed. I received an invitation to participate in a gathering of female storytellers in another city. They paid for my travel, my accommodations, everything. It was the first time someone valued my presence beyond its usefulness. I prepared my text carefully, not to impress, but to honor, because every word I carried was a testament to resilience. I traveled by bus, with my small suitcase and my heart beating like that of a teenager on her first solo trip. And with every kilometer, I felt myself drifting a little further away from the woman who used to ask permission to exist. At the event, I met women from all over the world, young women who used their voices as a banner, grandmothers who told stories with the strength of those who have seen it all and still believe in beauty. I felt part of it, not out of place, not an accident. One more, an equal. I read my text with an open heart. When I finished, a woman approached me with a face full of soft wrinkles. She said something I treasured. She said, "You didn't just survive. You taught us to live differently." That phrase accompanied me on the return trip, like a talisman, like a recognition I wasn't seeking but needed. When I got home, I sat next to my plant. It had bloomed again. 3 purple petals trembled in the breeze. I looked at it tenderly, because in it, I saw everything that had grown inside me. Fragility transformed into beauty, perseverance that demands no reward, rebirth that occurs without permission, without spectacle, but with truth. And in that meaningful silence, I understood that I was no longer seeking to return to what I had been, because I was no longer that woman. I was no longer just the daughter, the caretaker, the expelled one. I was now the narrator of her own story, the author of her freedom, the witness to her own transformation. And that, for someone who had been denied for so long, was a miracle that had begun with a wound, but now spread like a garden that no one else could uproot, because it was mine, completely mine, and it was blooming. Invitations began to arrive. Some were to read at small events. Others were to participate in women's circles. Some wanted to learn how to tell their story. Others just needed someone to listen without judgment. I had no academic training, no degrees, no diplomas. But I had something that can't be taught. I had experience. I had memory. I had scars. And that, I discovered, was a language in itself. One that many understood without the need for fancy words. I found myself speaking to audiences I'd never imagined I'd be speaking to. Libraries, universities, even a local radio station. I always said the same thing at the beginning. I'm not a writer. I'm just a woman who learned not to be silent. And in every space, I saw nodding heads, wet eyes, shaking hands that rose at the end to say thank you, because they didn't know it was possible to tell the truth without breaking down, because no one had told them that their story mattered too. One morning, I received a letter. It was handwritten in blue ink. It was from a young woman named Camilla who had seen one of my videos. She told me she cared for her grandmother, that sometimes she felt invisible, exhausted, empty, that my story had given her the strength to ask for help for the first time. I responded with a simple envelope and honest words. I told her she wasn't alone, that what she felt wasn't weakness, it was humanity, and that if one day she needed someone to talk to, I would be there. That letter was the beginning of many more, letters I still keep as small altars of shared truth. One day, while walking through a flea market, I saw an antique typewriter, black, heavy, with somewhat worn keys. I stopped to look at it. The man selling it told me it still worked. I didn't hesitate. I bought it. I took it home like someone carrying a treasure. And that night, sitting in front of that relic, I began to write my first book. I didn't know if it would be published. I didn't know if anyone else would read it. But I was writing it for me, for all my past versions, for all those who couldn't speak, for all those who were still waiting for permission. I called the book Sometimes Silence Screams. In it, I gathered my writings, my letters, my reflections. I printed a few copies and shared it with the women in the workshop. One of them told me she read it aloud before bed. Another took it to her prayer group. And so, without pretense, my voice began to travel. A small publisher contacted me. A young, sensitive, and courageous publisher. She said my story needed to go further, that it wasn't just beautiful, it was necessary. We worked together for months. We polished texts. We selected excerpts. We designed the cover. We used an illustration depicting a woman with roots at her feet and wings on her back, because that's how I felt. Grounded and free, firm and flying, human. The day I received the first printed copy, I cried. I cried for the Carla who spent nights in hospitals without anyone seeing her, for the Carla who was dismissed as if she were worthless, for the Carla who thought she'd never have a story to tell. And yet, there it was, her story, in ink, on paper, in her hands. They started inviting me to book fairs, to women's panels, to spaces where I'd previously only attended as a spectator. Now I spoke. Now I was heard. But it wasn't fame that moved me. It was something more intimate, more powerful. It was the miracle of having turned pain into something useful, not to justify it, but to prevent it from happening again. I revisited the house where I lived with my dad. It had been sold. The rusty gate was gone, along with the fig tree in the yard. It was a different house, with different inhabitants. I stood for a moment on the sidewalk, not out of nostalgia, but to close the door. I closed my eyes. I imagined the little girl I'd been, running through that yard, not knowing what was coming. I hugged her with my mind. I told her, "You survived." And then I left, with firm steps, without looking back. In one of the workshops, a woman in her 70s stood up to read her story. Her voice trembled. She said it was the first time she'd spoken about what she'd experienced with her father. She recounted things that chilled the blood, but when she finished, she straightened a little, as if the weight of years had fallen an inch. She looked at us and said, "Now I can die in peace." Not because she wanted to die, but because she finally felt alive. That night I realized my purpose wasn't to heal anyone. It was to hold the space for each person to find their own way of healing, at their own pace, in their own way, without judgment, without haste, with respect. I also began working with teenagers, young people growing up amidst screams, absences, and invisible violence. I spoke to them about the importance of naming things, of not taking on the blame for others, of setting boundaries. Sometimes they looked at me with skepticism, but other times, in the end, they stayed to talk privately. And there, in that one-on-one, small revolutions were born. I remember Laura, a 17-year-old girl who had stopped speaking after her mother's death. She listened to me with her eyes lowered. She didn't participate. Until one day, at the end of a writing exercise, she handed me a crumpled piece of paper. It said only one sentence: "Thank you for reminding me that I still exist." That phrase follows me like a mantra, because that's what we are sometimes for others. A reminder that they still exist, that their story is still worth telling. So I continued, narrating, listening, writing, healing, not with grand speeches, not with theories, with presence, with a gaze, with tenderness, with the profound certainty that every story matters, that every scar is a map, that every silent voice, when it dares to speak, lights the path for many. And although there were still nights of silence, of questions, of emptiness, they no longer frightened me, because I understood that emptiness is also part of creation, that not everything has to be full to be alive, that sometimes, in what is missing, lies the purest truth, the one that says there was pain here, but there was also courage. And where there was courage, there is possibility. There is a path. There is fire. There is history. The call came on a Sunday afternoon when I least expected it. It was a nurse from the Central Hospital. She told me my father was in critical condition. They didn't know if he'd make it through the night. I felt my body freeze from the inside out. I didn't know what to do with that information. I hadn't heard from him in months. Not because I'd forgotten, but because I'd learned to survive without his shadow hanging over me. But upon hearing his name, something inside me broke. Not out of attachment, but because of the unresolved. Because of everything that was never said. I took a bus to the hospital. In my bag, I had a bottle of water, a notebook, and a small bottle of lavender essential oil. I used it to calm myself in moments of anxiety. I opened it while looking out the window. I closed my eyes. I took a deep breath, and I remembered. I remembered the times I wheeled him in, the times I changed his diapers, the times he cried in his sleep, unaware that I could hear him from the doorway. I remembered everything, even the things I didn't want. When I arrived, the hospital had that thick smell, a mixture of alcohol, disinfectant, and resignation. I headed to the front desk. They gave me her room number. I walked through hallways that seemed longer than usual. Each step was an internal conversation between forgiveness, resentment, compassion, and justice. I knocked gently. No one answered. I walked in. There he was, my father, smaller than ever, more fragile, more human, with a respirator and his gaze lost in the ceiling. He didn't recognize me at first. I approached. I spoke to him in a low voice. I told him, "Dad, it's me, Carla." His eyes searched my face, and then, a faint flicker, a tear, a whisper, "Daughter." I didn't say anything else. It wasn't necessary. I sat down next to his bed. I held his hand. It was cold, but it wasn't trembling. I watched him sleep, breathing heavily. I wanted to ask him so many things. I wanted to shout out everything I kept quiet, but I also knew there were things that didn't need an answer. Just presence, just closing the cycle with dignity. A nurse brought me a more comfortable chair. She offered me coffee. She asked if I wanted to call any family members. I shook my head. I didn't want my brother there. I didn't want his mocking silence or his empty phrases. I was fine on my own. Or rather, I was at peace on my own. At dawn, Dad opened his eyes. He looked at me. He murmured something I didn't understand. I leaned over. He took my wrist with a strength I didn't think he had left. He said, "Forgive me." And he closed his eyes again. Those words hit me like a gale. Not because I absolved him, but because for the first time in his entire life, he recognized me as someone who deserved an apology. I cried, but not from sadness. I cried because something inside me loosened, as if an ancient knot had finally been undone. I stood there, silent, speaking to her with my mind, telling her that I, too, had done what I could, that even though it hurt, I didn't wish her harm, that I hoped she found peace, wherever she was. At 5 a.m, her breathing slowed, more spaced out. The machine began to beep more high-pitched. The nurses came in. They asked me to leave, but I refused. I told them I would stay until the end. They let me stay. I held his hand as he breathed his last, and in that moment, I felt no glory, no relief, no revenge. I felt emptiness, a cold hollow, but I also felt something inside me close, like a wound that finally stops festering. I looked at him one last time. I smoothed his hair. I whispered thank you for giving me life, even if it hurt, even if it was like this. Thank you. I walked slowly out of the hospital. The sun was barely rising. The air was fresh. I took a deep breath, and in that breath, I realized I had done what many fail to do, that I had chosen to be, without forgetting, that I had looked pain in the eye and not flinched. In the following days, my brother didn't show up. I learned he'd tried to secretly sell Dad's house, that he'd falsified papers. But I also learned something else. The hospital lawyer called me to review some outstanding documents. He gave me a copy of the original will, and there it was. My name, Carla. My father had left everything in my name, his pension, his savings, even an insurance policy I didn't even know existed. The lawyer told me that Dad had modified it weeks before his last hospitalization, that he had specifically asked me to be the sole beneficiary. I was shocked, not because of the money, but because it said something. It said that perhaps, in his awkward silence, he had understood, that perhaps, in some way, he had wanted to make amends for what he had done to me, even if it was too late, even if it was only a little. I didn't look for my brother. I didn't call him. I didn't claim him. I no longer cared, because I understood that true justice doesn't always come with punishment. Sometimes it comes with truth, and that was the truth, that I, the one who was cast out like a servant, had been recognized as a daughter, as deserving, as heir to something more than pain. With that inheritance, I didn't travel. I didn't buy clothes or luxuries. I used part of it to open a small community space, a place where women like me could come to write, to share, to cry, to laugh. I called it the House of Voices, because that's what we were. Voices that had been silenced for too long, voices that deserved to be heard. And every time I walked through that door with its handmade sign and its scent of coffee and paper, I felt like history had turned a corner. That pain didn't define me. That my past wasn't a condemnation. It was a foundation. And upon it, I was building something beautiful, something no one could ever take away from me, because it was mine, born of fire, but also of tenderness, of faith, of truth, of the life that finally was fully mine. In the weeks that followed, the House of Voices began to fill with diverse presences, women of different ages, backgrounds, and accents. Some arrived shyly, staring at the floor. Others came in with swollen eyes, like someone who'd cried all night and still managed to get up. But they all had something in common, an immense need to be heard, to be seen, to be simply respected. I didn't present myself as a founder or as an expert. I sat with them, drank coffee, and listened, sometimes in silence, sometimes with tears, because I understood that healing isn't about talking all the time. Sometimes it's simply having someone by your side while you breathe, while you remember, while you decide you won't give up. We had a simple ritual. Every woman who walked through the door for the first time received a blank notebook. It wasn't just any gift. It was an invitation to write her story at her own pace, with her own words, without censorship. Some held it like a treasure. Others left it in a corner for days, untouched. Until one day, without warning, they opened the first page and began to write. One Friday afternoon, while sweeping the main hall, I found a note taped to the door. It was anonymous. It said, "Thank you for existing, for giving us a place where we weren't ashamed of ourselves." I sat down in one of the wooden chairs, holding that note, and I cried, not from sadness, but from gratitude, because that sentence was all I'd ever needed to hear. And now, without having planned it, I was the one provoking it in others. I thought again about my father, about my brother, about everything they'd taken from me, but also about everything they'd unwittingly forced me to build. Because if they hadn't kicked me out, I might never have found my strength. If they hadn't left me alone, I might never have discovered true companionship, the kind that exists between women who share wounds and turn them into seeds. One night, after a particularly intense workshop, a young woman approached me. She said, "Carla, today I understood that I'm not broken. I was just waiting for someone to tell me that I had the right to rebuild myself." I hugged her, because I too had been that woman waiting for a sign, a word, a gesture that said, "Go on, you're not alone." And in that embrace, I understood something profound, that my story wasn't just about me, that every step I took, every tear, every silent night had been part of a larger path, one that others could now walk with less fear, with more light, with more truth. Today, when I look in the mirror, I don't see the woman who was cast aside as if she were invisible. I see a whole woman, one who cried, who broke, who was on the verge of giving up, but who chose to continue, who chose to love even when she wasn't loved, who chose to build even with empty hands, who chose to speak even after being silenced so many times. Every scar on my body and soul is now a testament, not to suffering, but to transformation. Because surviving isn't just about staying alive. It's about making that life meaningful, something that heals, something that inspires. And if you're listening to this right now, if you've ever felt like you weren't enough, like you've been silenced, like you were made to believe you didn't have a right to your own story, I want to tell you something from the depths of my soul. You matter. Your voice matters. Your story matters. And you are not alone. Thank you for being with me this far. Thank you for joining me on this journey of memory, pain, truth, and freedom. If this story touched your heart in any way, I invite you to continue with us. There are more stories like this, more voices that deserve to be heard, more women who, like you, like me, continue to write their own endings. Don't leave without subscribing. Here, every click is a way to keep these stories alive. Every comment, a spark that ignites other voices. Every video, a new opportunity to heal together. And if this story resonated with you, watch the next video, which is already playing. Because there too is truth. There is life. There is hope. Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for being here. See you soon.